They painted it as destiny, a rich land waiting. But for the native tribes, this 2,000-mile invasion meant their lifeblood wantonly slaughtered, and diseases decimated their tribes. 1 in 10 pioneers wouldn't survive the journey's monotonous repetition of death. Later, daredevil riders galloped across this same stolen landscape, a short-lived spectacle of grit and greed, its legend forged in just 19 months, as indigenous sovereignty was ruthlessly dismantled by broken promises and relentless encroachment. Whispers and printed tales painted Oregon as a land of improbable abundance, a place where pigs, already roasted and sporting embedded cutlery, supposedly roamed under oak trees. This fantastical image, coupled with more grounded realities, fueled a westward surge. Ardent missionaries envisioned converting Oregon's native populations, whom they often termed savage red men, to Christianity. Concurrently, the rich lands bordering the Pacific Ocean became a focal point of national ambition, widely proclaimed as the manifest destiny of the United States, a territory that did not belong to England. The westward trickle began as early as 1830, with wagon wheels carving nascent paths towards the northwest. Fur traders, accustomed to harsh conditions, pushed, pulled, and cursed their laden vehicles through the vast expanse they dubbed the Great American Desert. By the 1840s, these trailblazers were followed by sodbusters, agriculturalists, drawn by the promise of cheap land and driven by a significant downturn in farm produce prices in the East. What started as a drip became a deluge in the 1850s. This mass movement included a throng of saints, Mormons seeking a New Jerusalem, their quest for religious sanctuary ironically placing them alongside fortune seekers in the unforgiving landscape. Some motivations were less grand. One individual candidly stated he went west because the land wasn't fenced in and no one dared to stop him. Despite varied origins and impetuses, the route was largely shared, a formidable 2,000-mile journey. Preparations were extensive and centered around burgeoning river towns. In late March and early April, the Missouri River came alive with steamboats, these vessels transporting thousands of emigrants and tons of cargo upstream from St. Louis to designated jumping-off places. Initially, Independence and Westport, established old frontier towns on the Santa Fe Trail, served as primary departure points. Later, settlements further upriver, such as Weston, St. Joseph, and Council Bluffs, Iowa, also became significant staging areas. For the earliest migrations, Independence, Missouri, was the undisputed hub. Here, prospective emigrants could procure animals, supplies, and everything for a complete outfit in abundance. The town's infrastructure strained and boomed with the demand. During one peak period, the unceasing clang of hammers on anvils echoed from 47 operational blacksmith shops. The choice of draft animals was critical. Oxen were cheaper and more sure-footed on the long haul, their steady endurance prized. Mules, while more expensive, were faster and stood the heat better. An ox-drawn wagon party, especially in a wet year with challenging terrain, could anticipate a 5-month journey. Those with mules and skilled handlers might complete it in 4 months. All worldly possessions an emigrant family carried were typically stowed into a small rectangular box with a high canvas cover, the iconic prairie schooner. These wagons, often no more than 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, became their cramped homes for the arduous months ahead, sheltering them from the elements and carrying the tools, food, and heirlooms they hoped would build a new life in the West. The average load was around 1,600 to 2,000 pounds per wagon, a carefully calculated manifest of survival. Flour, bacon, coffee, sugar, and salt formed the bulk of provisions, supplemented by tools, cooking utensils, bedding, and perhaps a few cherished personal items. Firearms such as percussion rifles and Colt revolvers were essential for hunting and defense. The signal to embark came when the winter's brown-yellow grass turned green and grew to approximately 4 inches in height, sufficient forage for the livestock. As pioneers steered their wagons away from plowed fields and the familiar structures of civilization, the mood varied. Some departed quietly and somberly, the weight of the undertaking settling upon them. Others whistled as if their mouths were made for nothing else, projecting an air of bold optimism. Initially, the Oregon Trail followed the Santa Fe Trail across the Missouri border. Approximately 3 days' travel from Independence, the road divided. A lonely signpost pointed the way to Oregon, a humble marker for such a momentous divergence, unprecedented in its simplicity yet profound in its implication. The first significant landmark to capture the emigrants' attention was a large mound on the prairie known as Blue Mound. Here, high spirits often led to impromptu races to the summit, with emigrants playfully scrambling up, much to the vocal disapproval of seasoned wagon masters who barked at the greenhorns for their reckless energy expenditure. Navigating river crossings was an early and consistent challenge. After 1845, the treacherous Kansas River was typically traversed using flat-bottomed ferries. The cost of this convenience fluctuated with demand. In May 1849, the ferry price was $1 a wagon. By the end of that same year, the influx of gold rushers heading further west had inflated the price dramatically to $4 a wagon, 2 bits a mule, and a dime a man. Once across the Kansas River, it was customary to elect a company captain. This democratic process was often informal. Candidates would parade out onto the prairie, and other men began to fall in behind them. Each man aligned himself with his preferred leader, forming a tail for each candidate. Those with the longest tails were elected, their authority derived directly from the company's consensus. This leadership was crucial for maintaining order, setting the pace, selecting campsites, and organizing defense if necessary. The prairie itself, in these initial stages, offered moments of unexpected beauty. Wildflowers bloomed in indescribable profusion. Thousands of tiny flowers, with delicate petals and varied colors, carpeted the landscape. This floral abundance was partly triggered by a phenomenon entirely unfamiliar to those from the Atlantic coast, the prairie thunderstorm. These storms often gathered towards dusk, then abruptly ceased. However, just as night settled, the drums would roll again, and lightning flashed throughout the night. The reverberating thunder echoed across the endless prairie, a powerful display of nature's force. One welcome discovery was a spring of pure, cold water. The water gushed from a ledge of rock, falling about 10 or 12 feet. It was described as one of the most romantic spots ever seen. Emigrants named it Alcove Springs, and future travelers would find names carved into the nearby rock, a testament to those who had passed before. After crossing the Big Blue River, the trail followed the Little Blue Valley. For a time, there was plenty of grass and plenty of wood. The journey in these relatively easier stretches looked like one great picnic. From the Little Blue, it was a short distance to the vast, silvery Platte River. This river, a critical watercourse for hundreds of miles, elicited varied descriptions. Some immigrants claimed it was a mile wide and an inch deep, remarking on its shallowness and braided channels. Others, noting its muddy surface, declared it flowed bottom side up. The establishment of Fort Kearny in 1848, the first military post built to protect the wagon trains, marked a significant point on the trail. During one peak travel day, 800 wagons and 10,000 oxen were recorded passing the fort. Native Americans, observing the endless procession of white-topped wagons, referred to this route as the Great Medicine Road. Encounters with Native American tribes in these early stages, up until the late 1850s, were often characterized by caution rather than open conflict. The Indian threat was only a minor one, typically manifesting as petty thievery or the occasional demand for a head of cattle. Most confrontations were resolved peacefully by an exchange of gifts or goods. It was only later, as treaties were broken, their lifeblood bison wantonly slaughtered, white man's diseases decimated their tribes, and white settlements began to encroach upon their rightful domain, that trouble with the Indians really began. These troubles, born of broken promises and existential threats to native ways of life, lasted as long as there were Indians along the trail. Further west along the Platte, strange-looking sand bluffs rose on either side of the river, curiously named the Nebraska coast. These bluffs often echoed with the low sound of distant thunder, a presage to the arrival of vast bison herds. The ground would begin to tremble as a stampede of the shaggy monsters thundered past. The buffalo hunt, considered grand sport, became an almost daily event from the Platte to the Continental Divide. Buffalo meat was the traveler's daily bread. While some preferred the tongue and others the hump, all parts were excellent eating. The tough buffalo hides were sometimes fashioned into makeshift shoes for the oxen to protect their hooves from the hard sandy ground. Buffalo chips, dried dung, made a good fire when timber was scarce. Many emigrants were initially skeptical that chips would burn longer than wood and have no odor until they tried it themselves. Immediately after fording the South Platte River, the trail began an ascent, climbing a broad ridge. This change in topography offered a welcome relief from the monotonous Platte River road. The relief, however, soon sharpened into trepidation as the route entered steep and narrow defiles, culminating at the formidable Windlass Hill. Here, the descent was so precipitous that some emigrants swore the path was only a little beyond the perpendicular. Wagons were lightened, their contents unloaded. Wheels were locked, and heavy ropes snubbed around sturdy anchors or manually paid out were employed to lower the vehicles down the hazardous incline. Survival often depended on such careful, coordinated efforts, preventing runaways that could destroy a family's entire stock of provisions and transportation. Fortunately, at the foot of this treacherous slope, gentle hills led towards the North Platte River and the sanctuary of Ash Hollow. Here, a beautiful grove of ash and cedar provided a perfect spot for weary travelers to rest and make repairs. Wagons were inspected for damage, axles greased, and livestock allowed to graze and recover. The daily rhythm of the trail was relentless, a structured existence imposed by necessity. Each morning at 4 o'clock hours, the guard fired his rifle, the signal to stir. Women and children prepared breakfast over campfires, while the men struck the tents and gathered the animals. By 7 o'clock hours, the signal to march would sound, and the train would stretch its lazy length into formation. Every day presented the same routine, the same goal. The objective was an ambitious 20 miles, but often it was 15 miles or less, dictated by terrain, weather, and the condition of the animals and people. The landscape continued to transform, presenting new and dramatic landmarks. Courthouse Rock and its smaller neighbor, Jail Rock, served as gateways to a new and different region. This was a domain where rocks and buttes evoked poetic fancies in emigrant letters and diaries. One strangely eroded spire of rock rose from the prairie like a giant tree stump shattered by a storm. This was Chimney Rock, arguably one of the most famous landmarks on the entire trail. It was variously described as a haystack with a pole sticking out of the top, an open umbrella, a church steeple, or a large potato hill with a pile of rocks on top. Further on, Scott's Bluff, a massive promontory, was likened to the Tower of Babel, a Persian temple, and the ancient ruins of a vast city built by a race of giants. These natural monuments were not merely geographical features, they were milestones, psychological anchors in a vast and often disorienting wilderness. Emigrants carved their names onto these formations, leaving a fleeting mark of their passage. At 640 miles from Independence stood Fort Laramie. Originally an American Fur Company trading post established in 1834, then known as Fort William, the U.S. government purchased it in 1849 and garrisoned it with troops. The fort provided a primitive link with the United States, a tangible symbol of federal presence in the expansive West. It offered a blacksmith shop, limited supplies, often at inflated prices, and a place to send and receive mail. A little-used guardhouse stood as a lonely symbol of justice in a land where law and order were tenuous ideals. However, the real jail, for many, was the cramped living quarters of the wagon train itself. The constant proximity, combined with the shared hardships of the long journey, inevitably bred contention. If an individual was inclined to be selfish or quarrelsome, these traits were sure to be revealed. Yet this same closeness also fostered deep bonds, and immigrants drew strength from this intimacy during times of need. Mutual support was essential for survival. The frequency of death on the trail made its mention almost commonplace. Scarcely a day passed without some misfortune. An ox or mule collapsed in its yoke, succumbing to exhaustion, injury, or disease. Men wandered off and were never seen again, victims of accidents, disorientation, or, less commonly, hostile encounters. A wife or child might suddenly fall ill with cholera or suffer a fatal accident, such as falling beneath an iron-rimmed wheel. Firearms, carried for hunting and protection, accidentally discharged in the jolting wagons with tragic consequences. All these events were mentioned with monotonous regularity in diaries and letters, a stark record of the trail's perils. Cholera, in particular, swept through wagon trains with terrifying speed, its victims often dying within hours of the first symptoms. The lack of sanitation and contaminated water sources along the heavily used trail contributed to its spread. Despite these ever-present dangers, of the 300,000 people who started the long journey, an estimated 90% arrived at their destinations, a testament to human resilience and determination. Burials were swift and often crude. Wagons were sometimes driven over the fresh graves to obliterate the sand and prevent wild animals from digging up the remains. Names and dates, poignant memorials, were carved into every available surface. Most of these carvings quickly eroded, but at places like Register Cliff, indelible signatures spoke to all who passed, "I was here, and for a moment at least, left my mark on this world." In some sections, the sheer volume of traffic channeled the roadway into a single pair of ruts, which were stamped deep into the rocky earth by the passage of iron-rimmed wheels, visible scars on the land that would endure for generations. The mundane necessities of life continued. Warm Springs, with its naturally heated water, was nicknamed the wash tub. Companies often spent an extra day there for a general cleanup. Wash days were few and far between. Clean clothes were not characteristic of the trail. Personal hygiene was a luxury difficult to maintain. As the emigrants pushed westward, the terrain became increasingly mountainous. Laramie Peak, tall and majestic, and the imposing Laramie Range were often anxiously mistaken by travelers for the main chain of the Rocky Mountains. Near Red Buttes, the emigrants saw the Platte River for the last time. They had followed this unique river for 500 miles. The native Pawnee had called it Nebraska, meaning land of shallow water. The first French trappers named it the Platte, a French word meaning flat water. For much of its course, it looked like a small bankless stream lying on top of the ground. Yet this sad, miserable, insignificant river had carved a long green ribbon across a desolate land. It was a lifeline of grass and water, proving invaluable to the westward migration. The trail then led to a great outcropping of rock on the barren plain. Here, there was no other choice. All westbound travelers had to pass by Independence Rock. This massive granite formation was the most famous landmark on the trail. It was beneath the shadow of this rock that early fur trappers celebrated the 4th of July by christening the rock as Independence. The ascent was easy, and from its summit, emigrants gained a panoramic view of the surrounding country, a brief respite, and a moment to contemplate the immense journey still ahead. Many added their names to the thousands already inscribed on its surface, creating a vast open-air register of the Westward Passage. Approximately 4 miles west of Independence Rock, the Sweetwater River cut a V-shaped notch through a granite ridge. This dramatic formation became known as Devil's Gate. The chasm was deep and narrow, the river rushing through its base. Tragedy struck here when an 18-year-old girl fell from the top of the ridge. She was buried within the canyon, and someone inscribed a fitting epitaph, another life claimed by the trail's hazards. The Ragged Eye of Split Rock, another distinctive landmark in the Rattlesnake Hills, seemed to stand guard over each passing wagon train for days. This silent sentinel watched as the companies crossed and recrossed the meandering Sweetwater River, its course dictating the path of the wagons. Between Split Rock and the crucial South Pass, the climate became noticeably arid and the land barren. Water sources grew scarcer, and forage for the animals thinned. One notable exception was a small oasis in the form of a grassy marsh called Ice Slough. Here, a natural peat bog insulated winter ice, preserving it through the warm summer months. Emigrants dug down 18 inches and found a layer of solid, clear ice. They put some in their water kegs and enjoyed the luxury of ice water that day, a rare treat in the increasingly harsh environment. As they neared the famed South Pass, this 20-mile-wide gateway through the Rocky Mountains was often a disappointment. It was not a narrow, dramatic mountain pass as many imagined. If one did not know its significance, it was indistinguishable from any other place on the high plains. To the south lay the Oregon Buttes, and to the north, the snow-capped, jagged peaks of the Wind River Range dominated the skyline. Yet, it was only when immigrants actually saw water flowing west towards the Pacific that they truly believed they had crossed the backbone of the continent. This continental divide marked a profound psychological as well as geographical milestone. They had traveled 1,000 miles through trackless wilderness and over deep and wide rivers. For 2 months, they had endured scorching sun and drenching rain. Some, inevitably, had not made it this far. But those who did reach this point were halfway to Oregon. The story of the Mormon migration is intrinsically linked to this westward movement. Originally established on the east bank of the Mississippi River, the city of Nauvoo had prospered to become the largest city in Illinois. It was the headquarters and gathering place for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In 1844, Joseph Smith, the founder and leader of the church, announced that he was a candidate for President of the United States. This, combined with unique religious practices, ignited political and religious violence. Smith was jailed on charges of treason and subsequently murdered by an armed mob. 2 uneasy years passed before Brigham Young led a portion of the saints in a winter exodus across the frozen Mississippi River. This event initiated one of the most remarkable folk movements in history. By the late 1840s, hundreds of Mormon families had joined the toiling throngs heading west on the Oregon Trail, initially with wagons and later with handcarts. In a desperate effort to enable poorer converts to make the journey, the saints fled the violence and followed prophecy to a new homeland in a valley of the Rocky Mountains. They crossed South Pass, forded the Little Sandy, and followed the well-watered route to Fort Bridger. This trading post, established by the famed mountain man Jim Bridger, was a small trading post on Black's Fork of the Green River. It marked the point where the Mormon Trail branched off, heading towards the Great Salt Lake Valley. The main Oregon Trail continued westward, but route variations emerged. Sublet's Cutoff, also known as Greenwood's Cutoff, became popular, especially when the 49ers traded Oregon fever for gold fever. Impatient and in a hurry, the great throng of gold seekers opted for this 50-mile, waterless, non-stop trek to the Green River. This shortcut saved 3 days of travel compared to the Fort Bridger route, but the price was a grueling, arid passage that pushed animals and people to their limits. After the ordeal of the cutoff, they rejoined the Fort Bridger Road at the Bear River. Wagons were scattered for miles across this broad river valley, all the way to Soda Springs. At Soda Springs, a collection of small geysers and bubbling springs offered another natural marvel. The water from these springs all had the tangy taste of soda water. One old man with a lively imagination claimed it made a delicious lemonade when mixed with sugar and syrup. Emigrants often collected the water, believing it had healthful properties. About a week after leaving Soda Springs, the emigrants reached Fort Hall. This post, located on the banks of the Snake River, was owned by the British Hudson's Bay Company. The whitewashed fortification on the plain had an early heyday as a crucial fur trading outpost. However, the decline of the fur trade had brought on decay, and by 1853 it was completely abandoned by the company, though it continued to serve as a landmark and occasional resupply point for emigrants. Near Fort Hall, the emigrants encountered a river that early French trappers had chillingly named the Accursed Mad River. Its deceptive calmness would suddenly transform into a labyrinth of rapids and white water. For the next 200 miles through rock and desert, the covered wagons snaked along a river so twisting it became universally known as the Snake. Its canyon walls, often perpendicular, denied drinking water to thirsty people and animals, even as the river flowed tantalizingly close. The surrounding land was rough, jagged, and destitute of grass. It was indeed a land of ruin, violence, and fire. The volcanic rock and arid conditions made travel exceptionally difficult. Yet, this harshness was interrupted by a series of beautiful and irresistible waterfalls, moments of stark beauty amidst the desolation. Here, too, they encountered mosquitoes, so numerous that you could stick out your hand and get a handful. Flowing for miles beneath a lava landscape, an underground river emerged from the canyon walls above the Snake in 1,000 springs, creating the 1,000 Springs area a welcome sight. Further on, 3 islands provided easy stepping stones as the trains picked their way cautiously across the treacherous Snake River at a noted ford. This crossing was hazardous, with strong currents and unstable footing. The hardest going was often at the western end of the Snake River plain. Feet became heavy and began to drag. Clouds of alkali dust stung the eyes. The alkali in the soil poisoned the water, making it dangerous to drink if not carefully selected or treated. The dry air shrank the wagon wheels. Without warning, iron tires rolled off the wooden felloes, requiring immediate and difficult repairs. Even wagon tongues snapped under the strain of the rough terrain. Here, the sky overhead was brass, and the earth was smoke and iron under your feet. Everywhere, the pungent odor of sagebrush filled the air. Finally, the emigrants saw the Snake River for the last time. The menacing river was exchanged for the ominous Blue Mountains looming on the western horizon. Their prominent peaks seemed to be a resting place for clouds. As the emigrants watched in awe, they remembered the solemn warning. An early snowstorm would be fatal. These mountains represented the last major physical barrier before reaching the Columbia River basin. They were also the final dumping ground for cherished articles of furniture. These items, which had been laboriously hauled for hundreds, even thousands of miles, formed elegant heaps of articles found along the road. Heirlooms of colonial days that had crossed the Alleghenies and reached the western frontier could not survive the rigors of the Oregon Trail's final mountain crossing. The need to lighten loads for the steep ascents and the urgency to beat the winter snows forced agonizing decisions. In contrast to the tedious drag and the constant threat of snow, spirits were refreshed by sparkling streams of pure water and the cool shade of the first forest since leaving Missouri. The scent of pine and fir was a welcome change from the dust and sagebrush. Now, rolling hills descended into the Columbia River Valley. The emigrants knew this mighty river, flowed through the Cascade Mountains, and emptied into the Pacific Ocean. The goal was now within reach. The Dalles, a small Methodist mission, marked the end of the wagon road for many early travelers. From this point, emigrants often floated downstream to Fort Vancouver on log rafts or bateaux, a perilous river journey that involved navigating treacherous rapids like the Cascades of the Columbia. However, in 1845, an enterprising pioneer named Samuel K. Barlow insisted that God never made a mountain without leaving a way to get over it. He proved his point by hewing a wagon road over the snow-capped Mount Hood and into the Willamette Valley, creating the Barlow Road. This toll road, though difficult, offered an overland alternative to the dangerous river passage. The raft trip, for those who chose or were forced to take it, was a pleasant contrast to the dusty trail, except when the old river surged through layers of rock lava, which tossed the small rafts about and capsized them. Past Beacon Rock, the waters calmed, and hanging waterfalls enchanted the eye on the way to Fort Vancouver. Fort Vancouver, established in 1824 by the Hudson's Bay Company, was the main supply depot for the British enterprise in the Pacific Northwest. The first arriving American emigrants were often tired, hungry, and low on supplies. Dr. John McLaughlin, the chief factor of the fort, a formidable but ultimately compassionate figure, furnished supplies and extended credit to the destitute travelers. Ironically, this generosity from McLaughlin, an Englishman representing British interests, helped to secure Oregon for the United States by enabling American settlers to survive their first critical months in the new land. The destiny of Oregon was now manifest. The roots of an empire began to grow, an empire that would soon leap the continent and occupy both shores. The trails that had brought people west were exchanged for routes that kept them there. By the 1870s, new routes, primarily railroads, would begin to bring people west by the tens of thousands. What had once been so important and essential became a victim of neglect and decay. Spectacular waterfalls were replaced by dams and power plants. Small settlements grew into large towns and cities. Yet, for a brief moment in history, like the passing shadow of a cloud across the timeline, an incredible 0-mile journey by foot and wagon had left its mark. It was the first transcontinental wagon road. In 1850, California became the 31st state. However, a vast distance of 2,000 miles separated California from the other states. 2,000 miles of what was often described as wilderness. The gold rush of 1849 had drawn thousands to California. and these new citizens urgently requested regular postal service to connect them with the rest of the nation. Mail service in the 1850s was slow, erratic, and expensive. Letters transported by wagon trains took many months to cross the continent, and some mail never reached its destination at all. Ocean-going steamships, subsidized by the government, carried the bulk of the mail. This sea route, which included a 50-mile overland trek through the jungles of Panama, required approximately 6 weeks for delivery. However, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company's schedule was notoriously unreliable. In an effort to improve postal communications, the government experimented with various overland methods, including mules, pack horses, and even camels. None of these alternatives proved successful. Ultimately, the Post Office Department awarded a 6-year contract to the Butterfield Overland Mail Company. This company was formed by the merger of Adams American National Express and Wells Fargo Express. By 1858, Butterfield stagecoaches were making regular journeys back and forth along the southern route, also known as the Oxbow Road. This trail formed a long, flat crescent between St. Louis and Memphis in the east and San Francisco in the west. However, proponents of a central route argued that their proposed passage westward was more direct and therefore faster. This route generally followed the old Oregon and California trails. While shorter, mail carriers on this path faced significant difficulties from winter storms and attacks by Native American tribes whose lands were being encroached upon. During 1859, several unrelated events drew increased attention to the central route. The escalating issue of slavery had pushed the nation towards the brink of civil war. Both North and South coveted the growing wealth and population of California. The South had access to California via the Butterfield, southern route. The North, therefore, felt compelled to maintain the central route. The Pikes Peak gold rush and the discovery of the Comstock lode in Nevada once again sent fortune seekers packing their belongings and hurrying west along this central road. Railroads had already crossed Missouri, and plans were underway to lay tracks all the way to the Pacific. The South favored a southern railway route, while the North advocated for the Central Passage. In 1859, another factor pushed the central route to the forefront: California's persistent demand for faster mail service. Lexington, Missouri was a busy commercial center on the western frontier. Here, two successful businessmen, William H. Russell and William B. Waddell, became partners, initially focusing on delivering supplies to U.S. Army forts. Alexander Majors, a modest farmer in 1848, sold his farm, purchased 6 wagons, and began freighting goods on the Santa Fe Trail. Within 6 years, he owned and operated the largest freighting company in the West. In 1855, Majors joined Russell and Waddell as a business partner in their new enterprise. Within this firm, Russell was responsible for securing contracts. Majors served as the field manager overseeing operations, and Waddell handled the finances. Within 2 years, their company, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, had established a near monopoly on all military freighting west of the Missouri River. They subsequently formed the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company, COC and PP Express Company. In the 18th of January 60, encouraged by California Senator William Gwin, William Russell decided to make a bold gamble. He proposed to demonstrate reliable, fast mail service over the central route. His objective was to secure a coveted $1 million government mail contract. To achieve this, he envisioned something spectacular, an endeavor that would capture the public imagination, the Pony Express. Previous investments had already plunged the freighting firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell deep into debt. Nevertheless, Russell, confident he could secure the lucrative government mail contract, persuaded his partners to undertake the audacious Pony Express project. Alexander Majors required his employees to take an oath. "Before the great and living God, while I am an employee of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, I will not use profane language, I will not drink intoxicating liquors, I will not gamble, I will not treat animals cruelly, and I will not do anything else that is incompatible with the conduct of a gentleman. And I agree that if I violate any part of this oath, I will forfeit my pay and be discharged. The logistical undertaking was enormous. 500 horses, young, strong, swift, and possessing great endurance, were purchased. St. Joseph, Missouri was selected as the eastern terminus. It was the first town on the Missouri River to have both telegraph and railroad connections, crucial for receiving eastbound mail and news quickly. Sacramento, California was designated the western terminus. Along the nearly 2,000-mile route, the company established over 150 stations. Relay stations were situated every 10 to 15 miles. These were typically small Spartan shelters, where riders were allowed a mere 2 minutes to dismount their exhausted horse and swing onto a fresh mount. Home stations were located every 50 to 75 miles. At these larger facilities, which offered basic food and lodging, fresh riders took over the mail run. The mail itself was carried in a specially designed leather pouch called a mochila, which fitted over the saddle. It had 4 locked pockets, or cantinas, for the mail. Only the station masters at each end of the route and at military posts had keys. The weight of the mail was strictly limited, initially to 20 pounds. Postage was expensive, with most letters costing between $2.50 and $0 per half ounce, a considerable sum at the time. The company operators knew these postal fees alone would not cover the immense operational costs. Their financial success hinged on obtaining the $1 million government postal subsidy. Meanwhile, Congress allocated funds to continue the construction of the overland telegraph line to California, a development that loomed as an eventual threat to the Pony Express. In the 18th of April 60, the riders and their horses were ready. On the 3rd of April, a special train expedited the first batch of eastbound mail to St. Joseph. After a brief celebratory ceremony, the first rider, often cited as Johnny Fry, crossed the Missouri River by ferry and galloped west into the setting sun. Simultaneously, a jubilant send-off occurred in San Francisco. The mail was taken by steamboat to Sacramento, where another rider, possibly William Sam Hamilton, spurred his horse eastward. The riders often traveled like phantoms in the night, pushing themselves and their mounts to the limits of endurance. Approximately 10 days later, the first riders completed their respective journeys, arriving in San Francisco and St. Joseph. The Pony Express had cut the Butterfield Overland Mail's time by more than half. The entire nation celebrated this remarkable achievement. However, not everyone rejoiced. Some Native American tribes, whose lands the Pony Express route traversed, feared their territories would soon be overrun. In late May 1860, Paiute warriors attacked several Pony Express stations in Nevada, killing a rider and some station keepers. Horses were driven off, and stations were burned. After only 2 months of operation, majors ordered the Pony Express to suspend service in that sector. 6 weeks passed before military intervention suppressed the Paiute uprising. The financial toll was severe. 150 horses lost, 7 stations destroyed, and 16 men killed. This was a devastating setback for the already financially strained company. Despite this, when regular service resumed in July, Russell, in a desperate attempt to secure the government contract, increased the delivery schedule from once a week to twice a week. Everything depended on political support in Washington, D.C. However, Congress, distracted by an impending national election and the growing threat of civil war, failed to act on the mail contract. Russell, still hoping for a financial miracle, continued to borrow heavily. Majors and Waddell foresaw impending financial ruin. By the 18th of November 60, the transcontinental telegraph line had reached Fort Kearny in the west and Fort Churchill, near Carson City, Nevada, in the east. Steadily closing the gap the Pony Express served. Winter storms that year extended the average Pony Express delivery time to 15 days. In December, a political storm erupted in Washington. Russell became implicated in a scandal involving misappropriated government bonds. Although the charges against Russell were eventually dropped, his reputation was tarnished. In the 18th of February 61, Texas militia forces disrupted the Butterfield Overland Mail operations on the southern route. Recognizing the strategic importance of maintaining communication with California, Congress finally acted. It transferred the Butterfield Overland Mail contract to the Central Route and awarded it the $1 million subsidy. Under this new arrangement, Russell, Majors, and Waddell's Company was to be paid nearly $500,000 to operate the Pony Express from St. Joseph to Salt Lake City, where it would connect with overland stagecoaches carrying the mail further west. But it was too little, too late. The vast freighting and transportation empire of Russell, Majors, and Waddell was crumbling under the weight of its debts and vulnerable to its creditors. The Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company operated the Pony Express under its government contract until late the 18th of October 61. On the 24th of October, 1861, the transcontinental telegraph line was completed, connecting the eastern network with the western at Salt Lake City. With the advent of instantaneous telegraphic communication, the need for rapid mail delivery by Pony Express effectively ended. 2 days later, the Pony Express officially ceased operations. During its brief existence of just over 19 months, the Pony Express provided efficient and reliable mail service across the Central Route. It successfully maintained the North's communication link with California at a pivotal time in the nation's history as the country slid towards civil war. And, perhaps most enduringly, it transformed its young, daring writers into national folk heroes. One poem of the era suggested that no conquering hero of Venice or Rome ever received more regal glory than the Pony Express rider upon reaching the town streets, having ridden to the end of his route and delivered the government mail. Despite touching fame, the lives of William Russell, Alexander Majors, and William Waddell quickly faded into relative obscurity after the collapse of their enterprise. Many years later, each would be remembered and honored for their role in establishing this remarkable transnational mail service. That short-lived, financially ruinous postal service became an enduring legend of the American West, symbolizing speed, courage, and the relentless drive for connection. The Oregon Trail and the Pony Express, though distinct endeavors from different decades, both carved indelible paths across the American continent. They represented bold efforts to traverse and connect vast distances, forever altering the landscape and the course of westward expansion. Which of these daring overland journeys do you find more captivating, and why?